want to start, I'll ask you, Douglas, have you ever trusted the BBC?
Well, I mean, you can trust the BBC to do some things, and they do have something which we should acknowledge, that much in their favour. You mentioned before that they hadn't acknowledged Aitken's book. That's true, but just a few weeks before, and actually I think a few days before Aitken's book, Richard D. North published a book about the BBC, which is very critical, effectively called for it to be scrapped. I think it's called Scrap the BBC. It's not a great book, but its message is fairly clear. And they did invite Richard D. North onto Newsnight to discuss that with a senior BBC reporter. So I think we should give them some credit for this. It is the only institution which does regularly acknowledge its critics. When John Lloyd published his superb analysis of the media's problems in this country, what the media are doing to our politics. You know, the BBC had him on Newsnight. They did a 10-minute package he produced. So there are things like this that they do well, and which I think we should acknowledge. That having been said, its problem, and this is a monumental problem, is its so-called impartiality. And I don't trust them on this. I don't think we should trust them on this. Impartiality is wrong when you're dealing with right and wrong. It's wrong to be impartial when, for instance, like last summer, you have a war between a democratic nation-state, which is our ally, and a terror group. It's wrong to be impartial. It's ludicrous to be impartial. It's ludicrous to think that a terror group speak for one half of the equation, the democratic state for the other, and we'll just sort of remain impartial in this, and we wouldn't really mind who wins and that sort of thing. I think that's its problem. I think that's something that it should sort out.
Maybe. But wouldn't you say that that was a kind of left-wing agenda, Carol?
Well, I have a slightly different view from all of this, even from your introduction, because I come from the American and the pro-Israel viewpoint. And in the past 5 years, I've been at the receiving end of an awful lot of abuse, verbal and otherwise, in the workplace, from colleagues, from taxi drivers, all the way up to the most distinguished colleagues in the film and television industry. And I think that the problem with the BBC, excuse me, is that they are so almost obsessed, almost fixated on showing, as Douglas mentioned, the viewpoint of Hamas, the viewpoint of Hezbollah, at the expense of showing Israel or the United States in any other guise except this horribly militaristic, violent society. And my complaint is, why doesn't the BBC ever go to Israel and go to the Mann Auditorium or to the Cameri Theatre or go to the zillions of art galleries? The book fairs are so crowded you can't get into the center of Tel Aviv. With kids with piles of books. And Arabs and Jews getting together in Haifa, in Jaffa. Arabs and Jews live together in Jerusalem. And that is something that the BBC consistently does not show. Kate Adie on Reporter's Notebook on the weekends. The times that I have phoned in and said, as a journalist, I am appalled. Every week, it's some horrific thing to do with something happening in, quote, Palestine. Never an interview with an Israeli.
So presumably you found the coverage of the conflict, you know, last year, I mean, pretty frustrating.
I have to admit I was in the United States the whole time.
Right.
Lucky you.
But But I was aware from following it on the web. I was checking in to see how the BBC was covering it. So I wasn't here. But I was aware from friends here that they were throwing things at the television.
To me, and I've not worked in the news, there is definitely what I would call a Guardianista approach to almost everything there. I mean, you've been in television, haven't you?
Yes.
And you must have worked with the BBC at certain points.
Interestingly enough, I worked at Anglia for 10 years at ITV. And in the last 2 years at Anglia, 2 people from the BBC came in to, quote, reorganize our department. We happen to have the most successful department in the world. ITV Drama, Anglia Drama was the Rolls-Royce of ITV. And 2 people from the BBC were brought in. And I have to be careful here because I don't want you having the legal department on your back. But there were 2 people who came in, and first of all, the money they spent on expenses was staggering because at ITV, you have to be careful because you're answerable to the shareholders and to the advertisers. But definitely, their political views were so radically different from ours. We were a fairly conservative bunch at Anglia. And you could feel this it was sort of like aliens coming in. But I want to say, actually, Peter, that the darkest moment to me at the BBC in the past decade was the night Philip Lader was on, and it was on Question Time.
Yes.
I agree.
When that really was, to me,
Shocking,
the BBC.
Could
at
you
its
explain that
worst.
was actually the
It was on
ambassador,
September
US ambassador at the
13th,
time?
2001. Throw your mind back to the way you felt that week. Anybody who didn't feel something about what America had suffered has to have a heart of stone. And that was 2 days after 9/11. It was the first program that was on after the complete break in regular programming. And Philip Lader was the former US ambassador to Great Britain. And they seem to have handpicked an audience to foot stomp him. Now, okay, 3 years later, maybe so, but 2 days after the event, and David Dimbleby didn't do anything to stop this foot stomping, this barracking. And apparently, I don't know whether this is true or not, but Philip Lader burst into tears after the program.
He would say he was near tears on the programme itself. I mean, I agree, that was one of the most shocking programmes we've had. That was partly to do with, that was an audience problem, but it was BBC's fault for getting a particular audience. For Question Time, I didn't realise this until recently, they screen audiences.
Well, they insist usually that they are kind of a mixture of all political parties. They
Yeah,
always
but
insist
its idea of, again, there's this notion, the impartiality notion, this applies to audiences as well as others. The impartiality notion means that, say if most people in this country vote Conservative and Labour, and they do, that therefore if there were one other political party, however little of the vote they got, the BBC would get that party on. Now, I mean, you don't see this with far-right parties, and I think we should be grateful the BBC don't decide, oh, there's another point of view and it's a fascist point of view, therefore we'll invite them on. But they do that with Islamists. In fact, they do it every day with Islamists.
What is your actual experience of, because you're on the BBC quite a lot, aren't you, talking and debating with Islamists or people. What is your take on it? I mean, there is this. The reason I ask this is there seems one of the things that people get very, very annoyed about with the BBC is that politically someone from the right is always labelled from the right.
Yeah.
Somebody who is, in fact, often they're mainstream presenters or whatever, who are not from the right, are not labelled. You don't know what their perspective is. Do you have sort of experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, incidentally, I mean, it should be said about the general bias within the BBC is, it's really, it's no surprise. I mean, people who go to, good universities and who generally study the arts come out with a pretty left-wing perspective in general. That's just the worldview they have. I mean, there's no conspiracy about it. That's just their view of the world. And they go to the BBC and they meet other people who think the same way. So there's no great conspiracy about this. But it is true that the way in which programmers work now on this one is that they will assume that the culture wars and everything have been won by the left and that they're over, there's nothing more to discuss, as it were. And therefore a right-winger is a sort of anomaly, which perhaps if they just learn a bit more, they'll come around and they'll be normal too, is the presumption. It's perfectly normal to have a presenter like Raghi Omar, who has now seamlessly left the BBC and gone to Al Jazeera, who's just written a filthy book called Only Half of Me, Being Muslim in Britain, which compares people who speak out against Islamism as being morally equivalent to the 21st of July bombers who are currently on trial. I mean, that kind of thing. That was their main correspondent during the Iraq War. It's useful to remember that. It's useful to remember why their coverage was so skewed. But on the issue of this with the average interview, what happens is you get somebody like me who says, I'd rather that innocent Londoners weren't blown up for the crime of going to school and work. And then they go, well, there must be another point of view. We'll find somebody who thinks that is understandable. And that's what they do. They bring on extremists.
I do think that's still a very old-fashioned view of yours, though. I mean, actually, if you look at the evidence of how the BBC covers politics, they've changed a hell of a lot. For example, take Question Time. They don't just have someone from the Labour Party, the Conservatives and the Liberals. They have another, and that could be Joe Blogs.
Oh,
They try and introduce, and this was a new thing that they did, they tried to introduce a sort of maverick person to sort of generate new ideas.
Let me tell you what the
idea.
maverick person
The other thing is that in news, it's certainly not the case that they're trying to simply go sort of Labour and Conservative and that's impartial or something. In fact, they make great play to say we want diverse views. We want politics to express not what's in Parliament, but what's out there in the real world.
The diverse views are very limited. But the diverse views are particularly slanted. For instance, I think it is right that the BBC does not invite on the fascists of the British National Party. I think that is entirely right. But the BBC has invited on I think 6 times to my count in the last year on Question Time as one of the guests, a member of the Respect Party, which is just as extreme, just as vile, just as fascistic as the BNP, but it comes from a direction which people in the BBC somehow think is legitimate. I think it's illegitimate.
Are you talking about Salma Yaqub?
Salma Yaqub, George Galloway. Why are they regulars on Question
Salma
Time?
Yaqub,
Censorship
the last
for the
time
BNP,
she was
is
on.
that
No,
your
I would
position?
like censorship for the BNP on the BBC, which happens, and I would also like censorship for the Respect Party. You can't play it one way.
I don't think there should be censorship, though. At least the BBC has a liberal bias towards free speech.
No,
for
a
as many
liberal
different
bias
reasons as
towards the
possible.
fascists who come from the liberal side, as they see it.
College, you do an art.
My complaint about Question Time for years and years and years is that the school bully picks on somebody who can't defend themselves. And on Question Time, week after week, week after week, the audience and the panel bashing America, bashing Americans, often saying things that are so outlandish, and David Dimbleby ought to correct occasionally these things that are said about Israel, Jews, America, the Holocaust, about the United States. But they never have an American. There are so many Americans living in Britain, in high places, in very important jobs. Maybe some of them don't want to do it. But there are Israelis living in London. There are Israeli officials. There are representatives of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
And there are some outrageous things said by people like Salma Yaqub and Galloway and the audience that go uncontested, and you feel as if somebody's being bashed who ought to at least be there to defend themselves.
Do you think this is a form of bias? I mean, do you see this? Does this come across to
Well,
you when you watch
I
Question
actually
Time?
applaud sort of gladiatorial debate shows. I mean, that's what it is. And obviously, in debates like that, people are referred to that aren't actually there. But I think that Question Time actually has changed, and it will change again. I mean, I understand that it's on an ongoing review in terms of how they present it, because what the BBC is struggling with, and whether they get it right or wrong, all political news and debate shows are struggling with this, which is how do you explain, how do you represent politics in an age of alienation where people don't vote so much, where the society is fragmented? And that's a major question. Now, I don't agree with all the solutions put forward by the BBC, but it is nevertheless a question for anybody interested in these things.
Well, I nearly resigned from BAFTA when The Power of Nightmares got the BAFTA award. And perhaps I'm a coward. Perhaps I should have. But
Yes.
there are other
We should
wonderful
explain
things.
that this was a
Power of
documentary which-
Nightmares, produced by Adam Curtis,
Yes.
and the advisor on the series was Dr. Azam Tamimi.
And this was a series
I thought it was a joke. I actually thought this
It was a
can't be
conspiracy
serious.
theory.
More or less was saying that the
Yeah.
Cold War was virtually an invention, wasn't
The
it?
Cold War was an invention.
And the war on
so was
terror.
The war on terror does not really exist. Terrorism does not really exist. It exists in the minds of our leaders, and they've created it. This are the 3 episodes of this. It was very lucky in its timing. It came out before 7/7. And the maker of that, Adam Curtis, who has now been fundamentally discredited, he's a kook. And he's now got a new series on the BBC coming out in a few days.
And also
The
there
thing
was
is-
that thread that the Jewish neocons in Washington
Running it
created
all.
this myth of terrorism that doesn't really exist.
What strikes me, though, is one thing is... 'cause-
About themselves.
Yes.
That's
But
really
we
why
should
I'm
hold the
there.
BBC to a unique accountability, because we pay for the BBC.
Right.
We do not pay for Mr. Murdoch's empire, and if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to. You don't pay for any of it. But we pay for the BBC, and we should expect them to deliver a service which is honest. And you talk about the fragmentation of society and so on. With cynicism about politics is made considerably worse by having a cynical broadcaster like the BBC, which produces and pumps out cynicism about politicians, which produces this stuff and pumps it out on taxpayers' money.
So in that case, what are we to do about this? I mean, I'm torn. I don't want to throw any babies out with any bathwater. That's my feeling
What's
about
the
the
baby?
BBC. Well, I mean, the fact is, it is, great nature programs, that kind of stuff, great dramas, all of this kind of stuff.
And wonderful people like John Ware at Panorama.
Right, no, all right, but what do we do about it then? What do we do? Do we take away the license fee? Come on, I mean...
For billions.
So what do you think?
Well, it is the problem now as well, because we've got to recognise that people around the world think the BBC is this impartial thing. The BBC is partly responsible for the destabilisation of a lot of the debate, the current debate that is going on. When people around the world look at the BBC and see the BBC delegitimising Israel, delegitimising America, delegitimising democracy and legitimising terror groups, that rings with them. They get something from that. They learn a lesson from it. That has to stop. And the BBC has to have time called on it. If they're going to continue doing this, if they're going to continue contributing to the fragmentation of society by elevating extremists, then time must be called on the BBC.